But feel free to chime in with questions and whatnot. I gave you my introduction. I've been doing this third-party risk for almost 15 years. So I mentioned, came from J.P. Morgan Chase around 2009. Right after the mortgage crisis, they got in trouble from regulators for not managing their third parties. Essentially, that's what it came down to. They thought they can kind of go, not our problem. Like that's their fault. It's like, no, that's your third party is an extension of your business. Just because you outsource it and it's outside your four walls, you still have responsibility over that third party. So that really changed the game and started this whole third party risk, kind of put it on the map way back when. And it wasn't on anyone's radar back then at all. So 15 years later, folks are still coming online, just starting that journey. What's interesting is it doesn't mean that they're 15 years behind. It means that, they can lead. In a lot of cases, folks that are just organizations that are saying, hey, I need to do third-party risk. They're not doing the same things that, the banks did, 10 years ago. They're actually leapfrogging in a lot of ways because they're able to be more flexible, more nimble, less kind of constraints and legacy stuff to kind of drag along. And they're able to innovate a lot faster, which is kind of putting them ahead, which is kind of interesting. So long story short, been in this space for a while. I've seen it from all sorts of different angles. I've done the hard, proactive, build a team, assess thousands of vendors for a large bank that's heavily regulated. Now at Whistic, kind of on the flip side of that, sitting in a product space that's building solutions to enable third-party risk management for organizations. Now doing security for Whistic. So kind of seeing this problem from a lot of different angles and hope to share a little bit of that perspective with you guys today. So put this slide on here just to set the baseline. I asked this question. We do a little bit of professional services. People come to us and say, third-party risk is a problem. We know we need it. Whistic, we think Whistic can help us. And I say, okay, what are we trying to solve here? And I'll say, what's your program objective? In a lot of cases, I'll just get a blank, like deer in headlights look. That's a bad situation, right? That tells me that you have a problem and you think a piece of software is going to solve it without having really any idea or foundation for like what you're actually trying to achieve. That's a kind of a recipe for disaster in my mind. Yeah, we can sell you something, but you're not going to be here in a year or two. So this is a high level kind of definition, objective for TPRM. It's going to mean something probably a little bit different in your organization, but high level, you're trying to identify risk in your third-party population and do something about it. That's the key part. We can't just, hey, we found something. It's like, what are you going to do about it? And how are you going to improve the business, right? You want to protect the business, the data, the operations. And it's not just about security, right? It's about resiliency and making sure your operations that you may have entrusted to a third party are working as intended and available when you need them, right? So this is what it sounds like. This is sometimes what it looks like. So Anthony, you came through our wonderful TSA. I hope they treated you well. Lance and I gave a talk at Shared Assessments, and I always have fun railing on TSA because it's kind of a joke, right? It's just people in uniforms walking around looking important. At the end of the day, yeah, trying to make it safer and more secure, but man, you get the impression that it's not really doing anything, right? Especially when you look at some of their audits, they fail 85-90% of the time.
John, I got to take away my analogy of TSA and the DTE. I'm going to take that too, because the analogy's gone. Thanks, John.
Anyway, so I always joke it's called cybersecurity, not cyber compliance, right? And we could all, laugh about TSA, but here's some of the things that it really comes down to, right? It's compliance over effectiveness, right? It's a one-size-fits-all approach. Are we able to really identify those high-risk scenarios and do something about it consistently? Do we know what our objective and outcome is? If the answer is no to those, then you're probably leaning towards more, hey, I'm just doing this to kind of check the box and someone asked me to do it, versus I'm actually getting some real value in achieving, a stated outcome or objective, right? Um, I'm interested to hear from like Todd and folks in IT and from Millersburg, like CTOs. I ask this when I give talks just to see, hey, if you're responsible for a third-party risk management program, like where is it at maturity-wise? Probably take a step back and say, is it even a priority in your at your university or educational institution at this point? Like, where does that fit? It's on your radar, it's a risk. Circle of trust here.
I mean, I'll start. I think we just have an ad hoc process, and we don't have anything real formalized.
Yeah.
And I'm not aware of any PASHI governance that's requiring us to have any formalized processes
Yep.
either. So it's one of those things where, we're thinking about things, but we don't have a formalized
Yeah,
approach to it.
and that's not a surprise at all, right? Like you have a laundry list, you're forced to prioritize. And I was just talking with Todd, in higher education, as opposed to like a more regulated industry like financial services or insurance or healthcare, there is a forcing function, right? And not necessarily the case here, right? Like there's no forcing function unless maybe you're responding to some sort of event, which, you've been forced to without, choosing. So I'm not really surprised by that. I think the point of what I'd like to share with everyone here today is there may be some ways to improve or, up level that approach to third party without, sacrificing. It's not like, hey, you can do this and do all of your other priorities too without a ton of investment or resources. So,
Question.
sure.
So just annual, being underwritten for the next year's cybersecurity coverage for your organization, and even, to your question, post-incident, trying to get underwritten by the carriers and the reinsurers out there, although there may not be compliance that you have to back up against, there's got to be a ton of scrutiny, about third parties. So that's why I was curious about that answer there. If there hasn't been any, scrutiny through the underwriting process, for Millersville, was that an expectation or?
We're unable to purchase cybersecurity insurance.
That's a passion.
Yeah, it's a Commonwealth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Commonwealth.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
So most of what I would say, were similar, but I think historically, it's been handled at the contract level. Because every, company that we do business with has to go through the contracting process through the Commonwealth. Um, I think the idea is that the risk management goes through that contracting perspective. From an IT perspective,
Mhm.
we know better because, on the IT side especially, it's way more than just something that they write one clause in a contract. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
consistent?
I would agree totally. Yeah, and we have things like data protection addendums or,
Right.
Other requirements that we have with the vendors, but yeah, to your point, that all happens in the contracting process. And again, it's not really formalized.
Yeah, that's definitely growing too. Like this cyber insurance, right? It's like, hey, you know, we're gonna check up on your program, your maturity, and see where you're at, and potentially get a break. Like if you're doing nothing, then that's a higher risk, right? I'm surprised, insurance is, I'd say playing a little bit of catch up on the cyber side, to be quite honest. But that does come up a lot. So yeah, just taking a step back, higher level TPRM ecosystem. There's just a lot kind of orbiting around like a TPRM program, right? We talk about, said Lance and I, part of the shared assessments. There's a lot of industry associations. You have folks like Whistic offering technology. Essentially, with third party, you're trying to engage a third party. You're buying something. You have a vendor, right? You may have some data on that third party. You're doing some assessments. You have folks like Venseca offering some professional services to kind of supplement a program. You have all these kind of things sitting around. That's not even talking about what you're dealing with internally, right? You may or may not have some program requirements, right? A policy or an objective. You may have some stakeholders like, hey, I need this vendor. How do we know they're secure? So the business is kind of beating you down, and I forget who mentioned it. Hey, are we the party of no? And you're saying no, and essentially you're not enabling the business at that point, right? You're kind of holding them up. So all of these constraints and I think struggles internally are tough on top of all of the things kind of orbiting around the T-Prime ecosystem. So like if you're responsible for a program, it's a kind of a tough nut to crack because there's so many moving parts. But for the folks that aren't familiar with some of these pieces that sit around TPRM, that's a view. So kind of more in depth to like a program. This is kind of essentially what a typical program looks like. So if someone comes to us and says, we know we need TPRM, but we don't even have a program in place, what's the bare minimum, right? Essentially, you're building an inventory, right? There should be no shadow IT where someone in some other function is able to just engage a vendor and sign a contract and you don't even know they exist, right? There should be an intake process, and you understand what the risk of that vendor is, right? How are we using them? What type of data are we sharing? What volume of data? Do they have access to systems? Like, at least having a very simple view of that vendor and how you're using it is really important to understand the risk, because you're not going to want to go spend time and invest resources to identify those risks if it doesn't, if it's of a low risk vendor, like, the landscaper, things like that. And then you have your assessment, like the old school approach to assessments, sending out questionnaires and figuring out, having vendors respond to that, and essentially data collection, right? So you got to get the data somehow from the vendor, or we'll talk a little bit about some of these platforms that integrate data and make that process much easier and kind of speed that up and streamline it. So yeah, you're doing the report, you're identifying the risk, and step 5, right, I mentioned, kind of the most important part is like, are you going to do something about it? You've identified it. How do you remediate it and start to show some improvement and progression, over time? That's what I think business leaders, CIOs, things like that are saying. We're investing in this function. Like, what do we have to show for it? Have we improved? These are the questions that folks are starting to ask now, like some of our customers, like, yeah, we have this, but show us what value we've gotten. What do we have to show for it? We've done some assessments on our vendors. We've identified some risks, like, great, now what? So they're kind of at that point to start articulating the value of these programs. And that's one of the challenges, and kind of think the evolution of all this. But talked about not being about compliance, but actually being able to show some value and enable the business, I think is where a lot of larger organizations are at today. No one really cares if you just did an assessment. Like, we don't care. Like, what value you bring into the business, and can you articulate that, every day? So, quick kind of state of the industry, higher level. Things are changing fast. I go to the conferences, I see people, they're evaluating tools and solutions much more seriously, just because there's been so many folks flooding the market. There's so many options, data, security ratings, platforms, and a lot of programs have been doing the same thing for so many years, and they kind of feel that pressure, like, wow, things have changed so much. I need to get out and see what is out there and compare it to what I'm doing back home. So we see a lot of that going on. AI, obviously. With this space and third-party risk, transparency is key. Like, that's kind of why I asked Anthony that, like, hey, how transparent are you in kind of tying your output back to some of the assumptions that you build into your model? Like, we have to do that. There's no leap of faith saying, here's the answer. It came out of the magical black box. Like, no, we have to show you how we got there, so you can get comfortable with that, line of thinking. Two different camps, right? You kind of have the basic, hey, I'm just starting out. check the box is okay. Compliance is fine. Like, that's kind of where you start. But we kind of put you into two categories. You're just kind of starting out, or you're a large financial institution that is customizing every step of that process that I showed, that circle there. And I mentioned like lack of solid program foundation too. Is they think folks think they want, I shouldn't say they want software to just solve the problem. It's like, you got to have a good idea of what your problem is and what you're trying to do first. And then, like Lance mentioned, like the technology enables the process in the program, right? Another trend I've been seeing over the last, probably 3 or 4 years is TPRM solutions as a product. It's like, if it's kind of like the old, intranet site. If you don't like give it care and feeding and love, people stop going to it because it's old and stale, right? So a lot of these TPRM products today is they require so much care and feeding and upkeep that if you don't have a large team, or you have a lean team, it's going to start diminishing the value. And I see that shifting now into more of from a product to like a service, not one that requires like configuration and care and feeding and data entry and manual updating, but one that you step into and consume data on a particular vendor, right? One that's a little bit easier to just get a quick view of the risk without having to spend a ton of time building it, collecting data, and putting all the pieces together. So from product to service is a big trend. Data is a huge trend. It's not just a repository to keep track of your vendors and their state and risks, but it's what other data dynamically is being fed into the platform or tool that can supplement my view of a particular vendor. And then integration into the business is another one. It's not something that you just like, hand someone if you're a mechanic, you don't just hand the transmission over, right? It's like, you got to connect this to the business, because that's where things fail, right? And then broader risk profile is another one. Not just security, that's kind of where we started, but now programs are looking to get more value and a wider view of a vendor's risk profile, not just security, but privacy, negative news, financial viability, things like that, resiliency. So there's application security. So there's all these different parts of the risk profile that are now starting to kind of be layered in. Lance is familiar with continuous monitoring. That's a huge piece of it, as opposed to like a point in time assessment. Hey, I have a vendor, I send him a questionnaire, everything looks good. The next week, everything changed. Like, you can't rely on that. So the idea of continuous monitoring is a big piece, and one of the reasons why Venseca offers that ongoing report. And I think someone said, maybe Lance said, like, questionnaires, that way of operating is kind of dying, right? That's just a method. The objective has stayed the same. Sending questionnaires to vendors is just one way to achieve that, and that's the whole point of this, right? Is there's an evolution, and that method is slowly kind of being replaced with some other ways. Consolidation pressure, right? What else can this piece of software do, right? Hey, I have this other GRC tool. It has TPRM. It's not as good, but I'm going to save a bunch of money, and I can live with that. So there's a constant, I think, pressure we see there. Talked about ROI justification, and maybe being a business enabler and being able to show value and not just be a back office function. And I think the challenge, which is kind of end on the experience part, the challenge is kind of showed that ecosystem, right? You have the tools, you have the data, you have the services, you have the AI, you have all this, you may have some data integrations, and you kind of step in there and look at a vendor profile and be like, what the heck am I looking at here? I think whoever can kind of tie all that together with a good experience, it's actually practical and valuable in a day-to-day, setting is going to win. So that's something that we're trying to build, and coming from that space is part of the product knowledge I'm trying push into Whistic. So I won't bore you with some of these some stats here, but moving from legacy, the old way of doing things, sending questionnaires, waiting for requests, Lance mentioned, we just beat the heck up out of our vendors, and like we don't care about the experience. We just kind of drag them along for the ride. Some of these solutions have the vendor in mind, right? So it's not as painful, and you have the ability to not be a one size fits all program, right? It's like, hey, I'm gonna apply the same level of due diligence against all of my vendors. That just doesn't make sense, right? And then the manual analysis piece, right? Yeah, you don't need people to do this kind of low value data collection, administrative type work, because you want to focus on some of the more value add things like risk mitigation, right? These are some of the things that we talk about modern TPM, like what has changed over the last couple of years, right? I mentioned data, right? It's a lot better to have your hands and access to vendor data that can fuel a risk assessment than having to go out and collect it, right? And then tailoring your due diligence based on how you're using that particular vendor and not being forced into a particular framework, right? Like, hey, my vendor only operates in HECVAT. That's all they have. Well, I'm interested in the ISO framework. So having tools and solutions that are kind of framework or standard agnostic, so long as you have the data, I can put it through any filter that I want, right? And you're focused on risk, not compliance. I already talked about that. Integrating services into the solution is a big part too. And then obviously AI, doing some of the dirty work and the heavy lifting is really one of the key pieces of kind of, I'd say, modern TPRM. So what does it look like? Just as a visual, this is kind of how I like to explain it is, now you can have a huge funnel where you can just be greedy and collect all the data and information you have on a particular vendor, whether that be structured or unstructured, right? So it could be like a trust center that a vendor has proactively put together with all of their questionnaires and SOC reports, policies, procedures. They may have that available. They may have that, publicly. You could have like I said, ISO report or a pen test, some internal documentation, maybe you have a questionnaire, whatever, or some information you have in a SharePoint from a couple years ago. You can have access to all that and kind of all throw it all in the hopper and let the AI kind of do the dirty work and put it through the filter of whatever framework you choose. So if your program's like HECVAT, like we evaluate all our vendors on HECVAT, that's fine. You can use that as a filter. You can use a cake as a filter, a SIG, an ISO, whatever. It doesn't really matter. That's the flexibility with this new approach is capture all your data, get value out of the data that you have, run it through any filter, and you kind of have a consumable report or risk view of that vendor. And that's kind of like your new starting point. Before it was starting with questionnaires and you spent 80% of the time just getting to the point where you could actually do an assessment. We think the new starting point is a completed assessment, right? Where you can now take action and look at, okay, here's the risks I'm looking at. Here's where I want to focus the conversation if you're going to be talking to a particular vendor, and not so much leading up to that and the collection of data and all that administrative work. So that's kind of the exciting part is I think we've jumped to, made leaps and bounds and jumped towards a better starting point for third-party due diligence with your vendors, right? I wanted to show kind of what that looks like in the platform. I said I would show you a little bit about Whistic, but I mentioned trust, having a trust center. So like nowadays, vendors are much more proactive in building their documentation and due diligence and kind of putting that out there. We have a trust center. This is kind of like the vendor solution of Whistic, but you would put your audits and certs here, completed questionnaires, any supporting documentation, and essentially put that out into, you can share that with a customer. you put that into a data exchange or a marketplace, and kind of proactively put that out there. So I don't need to send a questionnaire. I already have it here. I just need to kind of pull it off the shelf and pull it into my particular environment, right? So if you put on your assess hat, you're a program leader, this is essentially the traditional assessment due diligence side of the platform, where you have your inventory of vendors, you have your vendor record, all the data on that vendor, and now you can start actually running assessments and kind of getting a sense of where you stand with that. This example is Okta. I imported their profile from the marketplace. So I have this document report. This is everything that we've pulled from Okta's profile, right? All their completed questionnaires, all their ISOs, their SOC reports, anything else that I might have, I can put into this repository and then essentially run a summary based on whatever framework I'm interested in, right? So I could do, I did not run the HECVAC. It's actually really long, but that's one of the frameworks that you could obviously run. And then you essentially have, like I mentioned, this is the new starting point where I can just take a look at these controls and get a sense of if they're compliant or not, and what the source is. So I have that huge repository of data at the top. The AI is essentially scouring that and connecting the dots and giving you not just an answer, but a source, right? Like full transparency. We've answered this control, it's compliant. Here's why we think it's compliant, because we found this source in this random document that was pulled from their profile or whatever you have in their repository, and we're showing you that it's compliant, right? So you can kind of weed out the easy stuff and focus on some of the things that, hey, maybe we don't have a great answer for, or we may need additional documentation. So creates a much better starting point for you there from a due diligence standpoint. So that's kind of what we're doing at Whistic is trying to streamline the whole process and make it available for lean teams, right? We work a lot with teams that are just teams of one or two, and they don't have a ton of resources to kind of invest in this sort of thing. Also work with large organizations that are customizing, a program. They have a very complex approach to how they define risk and their assessment methodology and the frameworks they use and the requirements they want to plug into. Okay, what does compliance for a particular control look like for my organization, right? So we can get customized, we can kind of be more rudimentary if you're just starting out. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to share with you all. I'll pause there. Kind of been going quick. I don't know how far along I am, but questions, comments? I'm interested. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, do you see reluctance for organizations to sort of start using the trust centers? The organization I'm with right now is like they're skittish about trusting, like Okta, for example, right? We're an Okta client. They'd rather send Okta our questionnaire than use the trust center stuff that Okta's put out there. And they're trying to be like, why are we doing bespoke questionnaires? So it's I think
Yeah.
it's generational or
Oh, yeah.
in trying to change that culture of this is the way we've always done it. There's a better way, right? And I think too, first off, the HECVAT was there when I got to EDUCAUSE, so it's not my baby, so you can call it ugly, I don't care. But higher ed is such a closed ecosystem, right? There's probably a finite number of vendors that all of higher ed's using, but yet all of higher ed is asking those vendors to fill out questionnaires, right? 3,600 higher eds in the country sending
Yeah.
Okta fill out our questionnaire.
Yeah.
It's funny you say that because you actually introduced me to Charles Overboya.
Yeah.
So when I talked to Charles, he told me he has 8 full-time employees filling out questionnaires. 8 full-time employees just filling out questionnaires for higher ed. 3 more for healthcare. That's 11 full-time employees just filling out questionnaires. So standardizing on questionnaires makes sense, and that's why the origination of HECVAT. But it's become complicated. So and I go about 130 years ago when Equifax was kind of crafting out the personal credit. That issue started with questionnaires as well. How well do you pay your bills? Yada, yada, yada. So those were questionnaires. Then they developed into a personal credit score, which is now the county, right? So what we're trying to do now is, Whistic has actually created the digital trust score, where it gets all the inside information and external information, that you're gonna eventually be able to say, that's why. And it's embraced now by Chubb and Beasley and Corvus, because if they have a digital trust score over 720, they can actually get favorable terms and conditions. So there are some evolution that's happening in third-party risk, but we have to look at it from a complete perspective. A lot of organizations look at it very independent. This is what I need, this is what I need. Well, as I talk about the empathy from the vendor side, why is Charles? And actually, Jason over at Zoom said he's got four full-time employees filling out questionnaires. Zoom, 4. That's all they do. Can you imagine getting out of college, and that's what you're gonna do, is just fill out questionnaires? Okay, it's not gonna be fun. So,
Yeah.
That's it's the regulatory pressures, right? Is,
Yeah.
okay, maybe we can become eligible for cyber liability insurance because we've shown these up, yeah. So there is that evolution that makes it a business enabler versus just a risk reduction.
yeah, so what we've decided to do from that second perspective, instead of looking at the 330, let's boil it down. You got down to 52 questions. I think we pretty much aligned. So 52 questions is still pretty heavy, but it's definitely not 330.
Yeah.
But what we did then is, using the Whistic platform and with our partnership, we were able now to take those 52 questions and map it to other things. So you're not wasting your time, from a vendor perspective, they're filling out 52 questions. And oh, by the way, you're 20% way to your ISO, or you're 50% towards SOC 2. You're moving in that path, so it's an efficiency. You're gonna hear that word a lot with me. It's efficient. We have to, because the fact is we're not getting more employees. You gotta figure out a way to do it. We have to figure out a way to trust people. So with the digital trust score, ultimately, we're not gonna have to look at the question. We can go to a credit score. So, apologize.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
No, it was good. I think, yeah, it's definitely a change, and it's not happening quickly, right? I think it's the vendors that need to be proactive, put this out there, and push back, honestly. Some of these solutions, like right here, I'll show you the trust center. You put this out. What we're trying to do is, enable a vendor to share this securely with the right governance controls, right? Like, I can lock this down. I can share this with a particular customer. I can, put it, cap it for a week or whatever. But the important part is the data is the important part, right? Lance, to your point, we don't really care what you use. If you want to use a custom questionnaire, that's fine. You can plug pull that in here and then run the data through that. It doesn't really matter. And then have some, an easier way to query the data, right? So like Brian, like if you have a trust center and you share with a customer, it's like, you can ask it whatever you want. Take your custom questionnaire, run our profile through it. You can query it individually. I think it just comes down to, you do the work for me. You got to do the work. It's like, no, I'm being transparent. Here's everything. I don't need to get as intimate and involved in your approach and your like, I don't care. Here's everything. Do what you need to do with it, right?
You get consistency of analysis. Right? There's always, the pushback I heard from the HECVAT side of vendors is we sent the same HECVAT to 4 schools, and 3 of them loved it, and 1 of them told us it was totally wrong. And it's because the analyst, there's no consistency of the analysis of those answers.
Yeah, that's all going to be dependent on the customer, right? And that makes sense because they all may be using that particular vendor slightly different. So, but yeah, the other thing we're seeing too is you're describing, standardizing an approach within an industry, right? Financial services did that. I was part of that, that approach where I call them the 5 families came together and said, this is not a competitive advantage. It's we're all spending the same money. Let's pull our resources together, do this from the center, and then share the output. They did that, right? So now they assess a MasterCard one time, and they share the assessment, amongst the banks, right? We've seen it tried in different industries too. Insurance, right? We worked with Blue Cross Blue Shield, it did a very similar thing. Said, hey, here's our standard. We're going to have all the vendors that the majority service, healthcare, and we're going to keep them in, essentially a repository, so we don't have to beat them over the head 50 times. It's kind of a one-to-many type of relationship. So we're seeing that. That's a hard thing to do. You need a hard driving force at the center doing that. So if you're lacking that, it's probably going to be a slow, hard slog to that standardization. So.
Are you seeing a lot of activity around the SOC 3 reports? Because you guys can pull the SOC 3 reports directly off the vendors.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, they're posting those and get them available publicly.
Yeah, I'd say external data sources is a big thing for all the platforms, honestly. So it's not, you have to have, it's like table stakes. It's like, well, I'm not going to show you the traditional, we can send a questionnaire, you could do a review. That's table stakes. AI is now becoming table stakes, right? Data, that's table stakes. So I mentioned that on my first slide. So how do you differentiate, a technology or solution? It comes down to like how easy is it to use, how intuitive is it to use, how easy is it to plug into my business, and bring other folks along, stakeholders, and show the value, right? I think that's how, companies like Whistic, how do we get to the top of that, is improving the experience, because all of these other things are pretty standard when you're looking at a TPRM solution. But yeah, SOC 3, web sources, public data, we're kind of like trying to, fuel the process with that data and let you decide, what filter you kind of put it through, and you kind of set the parameters based on your program. So keeping it flexible is the approach. So any other questions? All right. Well, yeah, thanks for your time. Mm-hmm.